Hey, so after the locker debacle, ordered not only an Aussie but a Torque locker. So what I'm gonna do is I'm gonna just offer some comparison between the three lockers. I just thought that might be interesting. Really, all I'm trying to do is just find one that works and fits in my carrier. If you didn't watch the last video, I had ordered a Lockrite. I had installed it. The center gap between the drivers did not come out to be what PowerTrack said it needs to be, and as a result, the locker wouldn't unlock. So I didn't drive it. It just failed the test that the install manual suggested. So I pulled it out, did a bunch of measurements, and so now, as I said, I've got an Aussie and I've got a Torque all right here on my desk that we're gonna look at here. The Lockrite comes in this somewhat bigger box. You open it up, there's a sticker, a manual. The manual comes clean. Those are my greasy smudges all over it. The locker parts actually did have some plastic bags on them, but those were all kind of misplaced during the install process. So you've got two drivers, two spacers, and two couplers, and a pin, a cross pin, and then a small bag containing 4 pins and 8 springs. The Aussie comes in a smaller box, so the manual is actually taped to the outside of it. Here's the box. You open it up. Instead of styrofoam, it's got cardboard. I actually like it a little bit better. So here's 4 pins and 4 springs. Again, 2 drivers, 2 spacers, and then this piece of cardboard here just sits over the couplers and holds them in place. So this actually completely renders any movement impossible. You'll notice this one does not have a cross pin. I guess you would either just reuse yours or buy a new one separately. I would probably recommend buying a new one just because some of the clearances involve the cross pin, and kind of annoying to put it all together and be short one little part that's throwing things out by a few thousandths of an inch. The Torque locker pretty much comes the same way as the Aussie, similar size box, manual tape to the outside. Open it up, it's packaged pretty much the exact same way. The one difference is it does include a cross pin, and it only has 2 springs, no pins. So having the cross pin's nice, just one less thing you gotta deal with. So here they are, kind of assembled side by sides, just so you can see how they look a little bit different. One of the things about the Lockrite that I like is basically a pin sits in this hole and a spring goes in that hole, and the way they go together, you put the pin in place first and then you put the drivers in, put a spring in through this pocket and kind of push it in with the screwdriver, and then it seats into kind of a spring seat well in the top of that. I feel like that's a really positive method of retaining the spring, and there's basically no chance it's ever going to come out. Go over here to the Aussie. Operationally, I mean, it works basically the exact same way. Pins on one side, springs on the other. One of the main differences is that it's just got this wide slot that the spring goes into, and the spring and the pin actually will fit right in through the outside of the slot. I mean, the idea is easy installation, but I kind of wondered if they'd ever had any instances of springs popping out, and then once the spring pops out, then the pin could come out too, and then you'd have a spring and a pin floating around in your differential, which I don't think would be very good if it got grabbed up in the ring and pinion. But doing some research, I couldn't really find any instances of that specific issue happening. Lunchbox lockers in general, common failure mode is just for the pins to break and come out, but couldn't really find any for Aussies falling out. The Torque gets rid of the pins altogether, so instead of pins, it has these keys, and so what you do when you're assembling it is you basically put this driver in first this way, and then this one you orient with the keys down, and it just slides right together. So no pins, and then you just have 2 springs that go into these spots right here on either side. So supposedly the Lockrite is one of the original drop-in lockers. One of the co-founders of the company that originally made the Lockrite eventually went on to start Torque Masters, and sell the Aussie locker, which I believe was developed in Australia and called the Lokka, which I think is hilarious because even though it's spelled Lokka, I think if you say locker with an Australian accent, it probably sounds the same. So it almost became one of those brand names like Coke, I imagine. You just call it a Lokka and nobody knows if you're saying locker or Lokka. But anyway, that's just my little observation. That guy retired, handed his company over to someone else, and then since that time they've come out with the Torque. So here's the interesting thing about these couplers. So this is the Lockrite, and it sits perfectly down in the teeth of the Aussie and of the Torque. So the tooth count is 20. It's 20 teeth. It's hard to measure those with a caliper because they have some ramp to them. So to get a really good measurement is probably going to require tools that I don't really have. But anyway, they're close enough that they mate. I don't know if that they would necessarily operate together, but at least to human perception, it seems like the tooth pattern is exactly the same. Torque does not use a spacer. These spacers are present on the Aussie and the Lockrite, and they basically just ride between the coupler and the cross pin. And so they hold the coupler in place, they keep the drivers aligned, and the coupler's all aligned, so even when they're kind of decoupled, then they can't just fall out. The Torque instead just has an extended collar here on the coupler that rides in an extended collar on the driver. They don't have to separate very far to be able to come out of there, but I suppose the keys probably do their job and keep things lined up as well. So between the Lockrite and the Aussie, I wouldn't say the pin and spring arrangement is all too different. They'll have 4 pins. The Aussie does have a little nub on the end of the pin to hold the spring in place, which I imagine probably helps keep it from popping out of that slot. The Lockrite has 8 springs. There's a little set and a big set, and basically the little set just goes inside the big set when you put it together. The Torque only has 2 springs, and they're significantly bigger. What's interesting is just the different spring forces. So even though this has 2 springs inside each other, it still does not require as much force to compress it as the Aussie. And then even though the Torque only has 2 springs instead of 4, it requires even a little tiny bit more force to compress than the Aussie. And I demonstrate this by stacking them all together and just pushing down until they all go solid, driver to driver. PowerTrax closes first, the Aussie quite a bit after that, and then the Torque is almost at the exact same time. So it's hard to really even tell. They could be just different manufacturing tolerances could make that land on one side or the other. The Spartan locker isn't really part of this comparison because I didn't buy one. So I don't have one to really look at, but I did look up the installation manual. Their pin arrangement actually looks like something that might be my favorite out of the lockers that use pins. It's a bigger pin, it has a groove in it, and you insert the spring, which rides inside the pin. You push the pin down into a hole, and then a wire goes in through the hole in the outside face of the driver, and it goes into the groove in the pin and holds the pin down in the hole, compressing the spring until you get it all assembled into your carrier, and then you pull the wire out and that releases the pin. That's obviously going to be, minimum chance of anything falling out during operation. So the thing that really bit me on the install of the Lockrite was that this driver spacing, once it's installed, is supposed to be between 145 and 170 thousandths of an inch, and it was at like 186, so way too far, even with brand new thrust washers, and it just wouldn't unlock. I've measured with the dial calipers, or they're actually digital, basically from thrust washer surface to thrust washer surface of all three of these lockers, they measure differently. And what they come up with is pretty significant. The Aussie was about 25 or 30 thousandths thicker than the Lockrite, and the torque was even another 5 or 10 thicker than the Aussie. So I think once I install this torque locker into my carrier, it should fit really well. The clearance should be exactly where it's supposed to be, if not even on the lower side of the tolerance. So that sums up the differences that I consider significant. Next step is I'm going to take the torque locker and I'm going to go out and install it. I'll let you know how it goes. So I didn't realize this when I was making the first set of videos. I opened up the packet with the installation manual. Not only is there an installation manual, but they have a little card with some information about their products, and then they've got 2 stickers. So the Lockrite wasn't the only one with a sticker, and in fact, Torque gave me 2. Well, there it is installed. Those springs were kind of a bear to get in. I definitely had to use a screwdriver. They were not going to go in by hand. Alright, it's the moment of truth. I've got my feelers set up here, stacked up to 151. Just barely fits through. It's tight enough that it holds itself up. I think we've got something that works here. Just to check the other side. That's even a little bit smaller than 151. Now I've got my feelers set up for 145, and they fit in pretty easily. So this side's somewhere between 145 and 151. I don't really need to know because it's well within tolerance. So I'm happy, and now I'm going to put in my cross pin and we'll put this thing in. So I know I said moment of truth earlier when I measured the driver spacing, but what's really the moment of truth is now when I test to see if it actually works. I've got this axle effectively chocked with a breaker bar against the floor. So the transfer case is in 4 low. Pushed this forward and leveraged the breaker bar against the floor. So then I come over to this one and try to spin it backward. You want to see how a locker is supposed to work? So now that it's working, I can actually put it together. I've still got to put in the ring gear bolts and tighten them. I've just got it mounted by 2 bolts. Need to put the unit bearing bolts on, and obviously brake calipers, wheels, and tires. And then I can put the cover on, fill it up, and peel out.